Well, let's go ahead and get started if that's okay with you, Ron.
Sounds great. Sure.
Well, welcome everyone to Radford Reads with Ron Peterson. I'm Elizabeth at the Radford Public Library. Really glad to be having this program tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Duncan Hall is our IT staff, so anything that goes well with the technology tonight, I'd like to thank him for. I've already gone over the general notes. Just a reminder, the Q&A, if you want to ask questions. We also have the chat feature. If you want to ask questions there, you can, but it's a great feature to chat with each other. And tonight we're going to hear from Ron about Chasing the Squirrel, the pursuit of notorious drug smuggler Wally Thrasher. And we're so excited to have his son join us as well, Wally Thrasher's son join us, Montana. An introduction to Ron Peterson Jr. I bet you all already know all about him, but we are so grateful to have him with us. He is the best-selling author of Under the Trestle, which I will hold up just to show you if you haven't seen that cover. He's a graduate of Radford University, where he majored in journalism and communications and wrote for the university newspaper. His background includes managing television advertising campaigns that appeared on TV networks like CNN, Fox News, and Discovery. His previous book, Under the Trestle, was the 2018 bestseller about the 1980 disappearance of Radford University student Gina Renee Hall. This book reached the top 10 on the National True Crime bestseller list, in good company with books by John Grisham and Patricia Cornwell. This book is currently in development as a documentary movie, and we're going to hear some more from Ron about that tonight. His newest book, which is what we're excited to hear about tonight, is Chasing the Squirrel. And it tells the story of a notorious drug smuggling pilot named Wally Thrasher. And the film rights to Chasing the Squirrel were optioned to Los Angeles-based Urban Legends Film Company. And this book is in development as a television series. So we've got a lot of great things happening for Ron Peterson Jr., and we're so glad to have him here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Ron Peterson.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it. And also, just from the beginning, wanted to thank Montana Thrasher for joining us as well. Montana was instrumental in helping me write Chasing the Squirrel with the information that he shared. He and his mother, Wally Thrasher's wife, Olga, both just helped a great deal, and literally couldn't have written the book without him. So I wanted to introduce Montana here right in the beginning, and then later on in the program we'll let him have the floor, and he's got some really interesting things that he'll share. And then I'll share a little bit too, just some things Montana and I have found out kind of after the book came out that didn't make the book, but kind of the loose end, if you've read it, is what happened to Wallace Thrasher, at the end, the very end. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. We've got a slide presentation we'll show a little bit later. And also want to thank Elizabeth, and really special place in with my writing with her is that when my first book came out, you're always optimistic about how a book would do. It was the first book I'd ever written, this labor of love. And the very first event I had in terms of, trying to put together a book tour to promote the book was in February of 2019, a little over 2 years ago at Radford Library. And she just did a great job organizing it, promoting it. And I remember my wife and I pulled in the parking lot about a half an hour early, and there was nowhere to park. And I'm thinking to myself, geez, they scheduled this on some night where they've got another event and there's all this going on. Nobody's going to come. And if they do come, there's nowhere to park. And then we got out and walked in and realized everyone was there for the book event, so we were blown away by that. And it was just a great start to the whole thing. And, a lot of that, obviously, that was we'll talk more about Under the Trestle, but that was a local story that happened right there at Radford, almost, so many of the events almost within sight of the library. If we could, Duncan, if we can get started with the slide presentation, and then that'll kind of give me some talking points, and we'll sort of go from that. And perfect. So yeah, so those are two books there, and then next slide. If we can go next slide. Perfect. Everybody can see that. Did I mention my wife, Kathy? So just wanted to thank her for all of her help. And next slide, just a little bit about me. And then my kids and my dog, Elizabeth and I are both dog people. That's our my three kids. Our dog Callie, my daughter Trudy is now a freshman at JMU, majoring in education, and then my son Brooks, who graduated from William Mary's and lives in DC now. And they're very patient. As I was writing these books, they were still at home, and were patient to do all the projects for me and mow the lawn and things like that while I was spending a lot of time writing. And next slide. But I mentioned Radford, and I'll start by talking about kind of how I got into writing. You know, I think so many people, certainly anybody has a capability to write a book if they pick the right topic. And I remember a professor of mine at Radford, and I was a journalism major, and it was Charles Millsaps, who was a journalism professor. And he would always say, just like your high school English teacher would, you know, pick a good subject to write about. And I remember in a lot of the you know, upper level journalism classes, we'd have papers to write that would be like a third or even, you know, 25% of our grade. And would spend a lot of time, the professors would, making sure we picked the right subject to write about. And that's really what I feel fortunate is I've written 2 books. You know, they're both local stories to the New River Valley, but in my opinion, you know, 2 of the most incredible true crime stories that, quite frankly, I'm shocked no one had written a book about them sooner. So I'm very, very fortunate, you know, to have done that. So that would be my suggestion. If anybody is thinking of writing a book, you know, just pick a good subject to write about, and, you know, that's well over half the battle. Next slide. My first book, Under the Trestle, just a little bit of background about the motivation for that. I arrived at Radford in 1984, and it was 4 years after this murder case that I eventually wrote the book about. And there was this rumor then on campus that there was a woman who'd been buried, or a former student that had been buried somewhere on campus. And what we'd call an urban myth nowadays. And, you know, I didn't really believe it. I think the rumor was she was buried under the Dedman Center. And one of my roommates, a guy named Chris Flanagan, was a criminal justice major. He later became a Fairfax County detective, which he is now, a homicide and cold case detective. But he was a criminal justice major and came home from class one day and told us this story. The lecture from his professor was about this case. And I was fascinated by it from the first time that I heard about it, that, you know, one, you know, that her remains were never found. And then also that someone could be convicted of murder without the victim's body. You know, everyone likes a murder mystery. The longest running show on television is Law and Order, kind of a procedural detective and, you know, investigation show. And so I was really intrigued by that. And then as time went by, you know, you get older, you get a little bit more mature, hopefully, and became a father. And I looked at it kind of a different perspective, in that, you know, my heart really went out to Gina Hall, the victim's family, just thinking about what they went through and how terrible that must have been. And years later, about the time I turned 50, you know, we all have maybe not a written down bucket list, but things you want to accomplish in our life. I'd always wanted to write a book. I had written, you know, one book, which there was no market for. And I had a literary agent tell me that the genre of true crime was really popular. And I knew right away what I was going to write about this case. So I spent about 2 years researching it, interviewed a total of, or talked to about 100 people in writing the book, the key people in the case. If we could go next slide. You know, an overview of the book, Gina Renee Hall, who went out dancing at the Blacksburg Marriott Lounge the night of June 28, 1980. She's never been seen again. Next slide. Stephen Epperly, who was 28 years old at the time, was convicted of her murder. And it was the first no-body murder conviction in the history of Virginia. And the book covers kind of from start to finish that investigation and the trial. Next slide. The lead investigator of that case, who was really, really helpful in that book, was Austin Hall. Still lives in Pulaski County. He's retired, who shared a lot of insight. And interesting thing about the story, you know, Austin generally at that point in time was more of a patrol officer, would patrol the interstates. He was not an investigator, did not work in the criminal investigative division that would investigate homicides, but just due to a unique set of circumstances, he was the lead investigator in it, and then did such a good job in the investigation that they kept him on the case rather than turning it over to someone who would have had more experience in homicides. Was the first one to interview Steve Epperly, whose picture we saw there. Next slide. Everett Shockley, if you read that book, you've heard about him. He was in the news recently, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the summer of 1980, as Radford and the New River Valleys are searching for Gina Hall, she could not be found, and Everett Shockley, who was young himself in his late 20s, had a really tough decision. Does he wait for the body to show up, which was what a lot of people advised him, or does he do something that's never been done before and try to prosecute Epperly for murder without the victim's body? He later said it was like a puzzle without the biggest piece missing, in the middle of that puzzle, which was the victim's body. Next slide. Next slide. And next. Okay, next. All right. I just want to show some of the publicity, and this goes back to the first event we had there at Radford. The fact that it was a local story, everything you hear that news is local, and kind of grew the readership regionally, but still, would like to have had more of a national audience, for the book. But very, very happy with the way it's done. The sales of it, is I think now somewhere between 35 and 40,000 copies in paperback, Kindle, and also it's on audiobook, Audible. So very happy with that. And the next slide. Elizabeth mentioned the Amazon bestseller list. And next slide. Interestingly, Scott McTavish, who grew up in Pulaski County, is an '83 graduate of Pulaski High School. His name then was Scott Self. Was another one of those people who'd always been interested in the story. Scott was in the Navy, I think worked in public relations, some in the Navy, got out of the Navy and went to film school at New York University at NYU, and has done several documentaries, and he was interested in it, acquired the rights to it. He and I are working toward that now, trying to get things set up for a documentary. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things we need to get in line to do that, but we're both working toward that. Next slide. Talk for a second about Steve Epperly. You may have seen in the news last week. He's been in prison since 1980, convicted of first-degree murder. And if you read the book, there's really no doubt. There's never been any other suspect in the case. He's insisted all along he's innocent, has shown no remorse, came up for parole initially back in the 1980s, has been denied parole every time. And he has a parole hearing, just an update on this case, May 17th. He'll go before the parole board seeking geriatric parole. He'll be 69 years old at that time. And just a little bit of inside information I heard from someone with the prisons in Virginia, the correctional officer, that he was at MCV for 3 days recently with a medical condition. Privacy records, no one knows what that is, but there's speculation that the geriatric situation, as well as if there is a medical situation, he could potentially get paroled this time. So, I'd like to invite anyone, if you read the book, if you're familiar with the case, a lot of people I've run into that actually knew him. You can write the parole board. His parole hearing is May 17th, I said, and then the decision won't be made until later. And Everett Shockley and the current Commonwealth Attorney of Pulaski County are both speaking to the parole board on May 26th after his hearing. So certainly any letters he wanted to send, 5-person parole board. And my understanding is with first degree murder and a life sentence, he'd have to get 4 out of 5 votes from that parole board in order to get paroled. It may only be 3, but my understanding is it is 4. Was going to write a piece about that and trying to do a little research on that. So just an interesting update to the case there. And so certainly stay tuned for that. Next slide. Picture of Everett Shockley and Austin Hall, who both helped me a great deal in going out to bookstores. This was at a Barnes and Noble, promoting the book. Was looking forward to doing that with Chasing the Squirrel with some of the folks you read in that, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't do things in person. But really happy to be able to do a webinar. And kind of segueing into my next book, Chasing the Squirrel. Austin Hall there on the far right. Early in the process, when I was working on Under the Trestle, he said, Ron, if this book does well, you got to write about Wally Thrasher. And I said, who is Wally Thrasher? And he spent about 5 minutes, told me all about it, ran through the case from the beginning to end. And after 5 minutes, I was hooked. And I said, you know what, I'm going to write about that, Austin. I said, can you put me in touch with the key people? And he said, absolutely. And made some introductions. In fact, if you read in the book from David Dean, the former state police special agent, Dave Dean was Austin Hall's boss for a period of time. And it was Austin who made the introduction, to him, and kind of got the ball rolling with Chasing the Squirrel, and certainly gave him my motivation to do it. So, obviously very grateful to Austin, because if he hadn't told me about it, I may not have written another book, quite frankly. But we were off and running after that. Next slide. So Chasing the Squirrel. Next. Thank you. First thing struck me about Wally Thrasher is, the same thing a lot of people say, is that he was a good-looking dude. I mean, no doubt about that. That he heard comparisons. He looked like Merle Haggard, Burt Bacharach. Heard some really funny stories from Olga Thrasher about how, sometimes on planes he would. People would think he was a celebrity, I think Merle Haggard was who I heard, and he'd get upgraded to first class. And then there's a story in the book about him going to Vegas and going to a show and partying with Frank Sinatra's entourage, and, just kind of mixing in. But, dawns on me that, obviously had those kind of gifts, but also somebody who probably could have done about anything he set his mind to in terms of a career, just as sharp and smart and innovative as he was. Next slide. Another picture there. He tried to enter acting. He auditioned for parts, as I understand, in the first 2 Indiana Jones movies. Didn't quite work out for him. Maybe Montana can share more of the details on that a little later. Next slide. And then here you see Olga. The book goes in the story about how they met. Kind of this whirlwind courtship and their relationship. A really interesting part of the story to me. And, I had people suggest, in fact, Scott McTavish, who I showed the picture of earlier, when we were talking about this early on, he said, you could write this book from her perspective and really make this book about Olga Thrasher. You think about it, you really could, just, what she went through and the whole story from her point of view. And what was really fascinating to me, and what was a happy ending, certainly if there is one, is that, she made it through all this. Initially, she faced some very, very serious charges. We'll talk about that a little later. For being involved indirectly in the criminal conspiracy, to smuggle drugs. And but she made it through it. Lived up to her end of the agreement, and certainly, for all intents and purposes, certainly must have been an excellent mother. Both of her kids are very successful and great families of their own. And certainly says a lot for her level of character to have made it through this and, done the job she did. So I emphasize that in the book, but I, just wanted to emphasize that now as well. Could have had a very unpleasant ending, I guess, 30 years later from her point of view. Next slide. But the example of kind of airplanes that Wally Thrasher, flew drugs in, typically anywhere from 700 to 1,500 pound loads of marijuana. The book makes the point, I understood from some of his colleagues in the business, that he avoided smuggling harder drugs. You look at marijuana, not trying to justify what he did by any means, but these days with marijuana being legal in so many places, you realize, hey, it was no matter how you feel about it, it was a plant. And so that's just kind of an interesting part of the story as well. Next. And next. A series of pictures that were in the book, kind of like glamour shots. I understand this was Wally and Olga's house in Florida. Next. And then another picture there, and that's Montana. That's correct. Okay, next.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, and then another picture of Wally with Montana in 1984. Montana, I think he'd been out doing some work outside. His knees look pretty dirty there.
That was pretty much his standard Virginia wear. Jeans and that type of shirt.
Good stuff.
Always had the boots on. In Virginia, he was the Virginian. So.
That's great. Next. So this, he managed to avoid any kind of police intervention for so many years. And then in 1984, as you read in the book, there was this plane crash into Fancy Gap Mountain. And I've talked with people that lived in Carroll County and out that way that remember it like it was yesterday. If you're ever around that way, or if you drive up 77 up Fancy Gap Mountain, you can imagine it's scary enough in a car. You can imagine what it's like in an airplane. But that day, Wally was supposed to fly that flight, one he had done many times, but had to attend a funeral of a relative, was a pallbearer in that funeral. So against his better judgment, he let a pilot by the name of Nelson King pilot that plane. Certainly it was something that was probably out of Nelson King's capabilities, and I'm sure he, regretted it for many reasons. But plane slams into Fancy Gap Mountain loaded with marijuana. The one pilot on board was killed. And then unbeknownst to the first responders, Nelson King survived the crash, left, and then, like something out of a Hollywood movie, here comes Wally Thrasher. He drives from the airport in Dublin, managed to swoop in, pick up Nelson King, take him back, and take him down to a hospital in Florida. So just a crazy turn of events there. But the result of this was, the state and federal authorities, now they had the goods on Wallace Thrasher. The registration of the plane, they were finally able to trace it back to him. They knew it was his plane. So he faced some very serious charges, not only for smuggling marijuana, but also, since someone was killed in the crash, we're talking felony murder. That is, when someone dies in the act of committing a felony, there's murder charges. So, he faced that, which kind of explains maybe what would have happened next. Next slide. This is a series of pictures from the wreckage. These were given to me by Wayne Pike, but these are some actual photographs of the crash that night or the next morning on Fancy Gap Mountain. Next slide. There's a police officer look. You can see how badly burned that plane was. Next. And there's another one, the engine there, or I guess that's an engine, but the book tells, I found the newspaper account that the crash site was not secured, and some point in the days after the crash, someone kind of rolled the engine down the mountain, managed to throw it in the back of a truck, and stole the engine. So who knows what happened to the engine of that airplane there. Next. I mentioned Nelson King. He was the person that somehow survived that crash, which is is just incredible. Nelson King now lives in Maine. He's someone I did not talk to for the book, was not able to interview him. Tried to get in touch with him. You know, he did time on state and federal charges in the aftermath of this. Olga Thrasher testified against him twice. You know, there is the accounts in the book of, you know, just this really adversarial dynamic between the two of them in court. You know, you can imagine that. I think Olga always felt that he knew more about what happened to Wally than what he'd say. But, you know, you say this about the guy, he kept his mouth shut. He was given opportunities, you know, to share information, to lessen his sentence, and you know, he did not talk. So he's anyway now in Maine, ripe old age, one of the few people that survived a plane crash like that. Probably one person who does know some of the answers to what happened, and you know, I would hope that someday he would share a little more about that. Next. This picture of Olga shortly after she was arrested. The sheriff's deputy with her, I think they would call her a matron. I've gotten to know her name is Bonnie Davis, and she was one of the sheriff's deputies, I think, that worked with Wayne Pike, and she shared, you know, about Olga in the prison. But I think here she's being transported to either her deposition or, you know, to a court appearance from the jail in Wytheville. Next. And this was somebody, you know, I was hoping his son would be on with us. This is Max Jenkins, who he's now deceased, but he was a Radford attorney, you know, really a well-known guy, well-respected in Radford as far as a criminal defense attorney. I mean, you know, heaven forbid if you ever had criminal charges, he would have been the guy, the local attorney to represent you. And in my research for the book, his son Robbie, I got to know. And Robbie and his widow had me to the house one day. We had breakfast and they shared stories, and his son Robbie remembered, you know, the book gives the account of the phone call from Wally Thrasher that night when he got back from the plane crash at Fancy Gap. But Robbie told me he remembered when that happened, you know, his dad being real quiet on the phone, going in the other room, and you know, the advice that that he gave, you know, it certainly helped Olga navigate that whole situation. Interesting connection, you know, I talked about my first book, Max Jenkins, after Steve Epperly was convicted in the book Under the Trestle. Max Jenkins is one of the attorneys that have represented him on his first appeal. And, you know, Max felt very firmly that Epperly did not get a fair trial and represented him in his appeal to the Supreme Court of Virginia. So it's just an interesting connection there. And next slide. So after the Fancy Gap crash, of course, there was an account that Wally Thrasher had died in a crash. There was a funeral, and crash was originally said to have been, you know, originally it was vague as far as where the crash allegedly happened, then was said to have happened in Jamaica. There's the fake Jamaican death certificate, which was not real. I showed Max Jenkins' slide a little earlier, and his widow told me that she remembers when Max brought that death certificate home and showed it to her. This is funny. This is not in the book. And she said, you know, Max, that's not legitimate. And he said, you know, well, you know, this is what it is. She said, you know, Max, if you can't fool me, you're not going to fool law enforcement, you know. But not that he was trying to fool anybody, but, you know, that's kind of a funny part of the story there. Next slide. And this is the ring. We'll hear Montana talk about that. You know, when you talk to people about the crash, the allegedly fatal crash in Belize, his gold ring would not have, if his body was burnt to ashes and the plane was so bad, the fire was so bad that the plane melted, you know, the ring would not be intact and in perfect condition. And if you read the book, you know that Montana Thrasher wears that now as his wedding ring. And we'll hear from Montana maybe a little bit about that later. Next slide. Here's Olga. She lived up to her end of the bargain as far as her agreement to serve as a federal witness and a federal informant. The second half of the book, Chasing the Squirrel, really could have been two books, because in the second half, based on her information that she provided to Don Lincoln, who's the DEA agent who eventually went undercover, the dominoes started to fall. The information she provided obviously was very good, very helpful, enabled him to do that daring undercover operation that the book covers in the second half, with the international exporters of, now it's cocaine, obviously, much more serious drug than marijuana. And eventually it was the 12 or 13 international traffickers, some really, really bad guys, that helped bring down. And all that was because of her information. And it's interesting to note, Don Lincoln's career after that, his career really took off, and you get right down to it. I think, as Olga would tell you, a lot of that is because of the reputation he made on this case. Thank you. That's good. You can go ahead, Duncan. But it was 10 convicted, 3 as kingpins. Just this incredible federal trial in Roanoke. Spoke with people that were at that trial. To this date, still, the biggest federal trial they've ever had there. There was fear that some of the people testifying were going to be assassinated. The U.S. Marshals had to take really special care of the witnesses, the defendants in this case, and there were even snipers on the roofs in downtown Roanoke in case something crazy happened along those lines. Next slide. Some of the pictures, and Duncan, you can kind of go through these, but some of the defendants, this guy, this is a typical perp walk. You see this is a Florida law enforcement agent, kind of all chesty, looking at this guy. The defendant obviously not really happy, and but they're, the officers there obviously pretty proud taking this guy out. Next. This was the Caleja brothers, the two, I believe they were Cuban smugglers that you read about in the book. According to Don Lincoln, who was undercover, these guys were, just a couple party animals. He went out with them, a few nights. So, very interesting part of the story. And they both had pretty stiff federal sentences as well. Next. This is Rafael Caballero, who was the kind of the head of the whole thing. He was college educated in the United States, had an agribusiness degree from University of Colorado, and put it to good use in his family's cocaine business there out of Bolivia. And then the other guy, the short guy, is Louis Tang Fortaleche, who was Panamanian. And he was kind of the mover and shaker, sort of the broker who would organize things and helped, again, second half of the book. This is nothing Wally Thrasher was involved in, but kind of helped coordinate the deal, connecting Caballero, the supplier, with Don Lincoln, who was the guy who was going to transport the drugs. So both of them had federal convicted and federal sentences. Next. And then this was Don Lincoln with the money, the DEA agent Don Lincoln with the money that was seized in this. You can imagine, I think that's 1.1 or 1.3 million dollars, but just an incredible seizure of cash and cocaine. To this day, this is the largest drug bust ever in the mid-Atlantic states. So it happened all the way back in 1986. And again, it was all a result of the Wally Thrasher investigation. So, just a tremendous spin-off that happened from this case. Next. So it comes back to Wally. After all the dominoes fell, these people were convicted. The question was, where is Wally Thrasher? And another one of those things that I had hoped to be able to get more answers. One thing I did learn, and have shared this with Montana, after the book was published, spoke with someone, and this was a secondhand account, which would make it hearsay, but that the book gives the account, which was the official account, that Wally's plane in Belize burnt up on the runway with him inside. And this person, a very reliable person, said, or a reliable source, I should say, said that that Wally walked away from that crash, that the plane, most of the plane burnt up, but Wally did not die, from that crash, which would explain why his ring was still intact. So I think we can say with pretty good certainty that he did not die on the runway that day in Belize. How he may have died shortly after, he may have died years after, but that much we don't know. Next. So we come back to Wally in Montana. The biggest irony of the story to me, when I heard that Wally Thrasher's son, Montana, was a police officer. That's I think he'll maybe share a little bit about that, but that's quite an irony there, I think. Next. And Montana with his family. Next. Mentioned the documentary television series we're working on with it's Urban Legends Film Company. They're out of Los Angeles. They produce a lot of television content for example, the Discovery family of networks is some of the work they've done. When you see a program, an hour-long program on Discovery or TLC or HGTV or the Food Channel, it's an outside production company that does that, and then they do that either under contract or they sell it to the television network. So that's what Urban Legends does. So we did about a month of interviews, preliminary interviews for the project. One of those was Montana, down in Georgia. Next. Olga also spent better part of 2 days actually interviewing Olga, sharing more stories, even some that that didn't make the book. Next. Joe Massey, you read about Joe. He was a Virginia State Police officer, worked in narcotics, just an incredible. Don Lincoln, the DEA agent, raved about Joe Massey, just what an incredible undercover officer he was. Spent the early part of his career with the state police in Northern Virginia, working there. And as the book says, and as he and Olga both talked about, had later on had a romantic relationship with Olga. And Montana, if you had one bit of insight about Joe, and if I could just kind of remind you to cover that when you get to it, I'd be interested to hear that. Next. Then David Dean, another, he was eventually became a senior person with the Virginia State Police. He's retired. We went to the regional office in Wytheville as his guest, did a day of filming there, and got to talk to some other state police folks, and he shared a lot of his insight. Interesting thing, he was the guy who, when he set his sights on catching someone who was in the drug business, he caught them. And Wally Thrasher is one of the few guys that he didn't catch. So interesting cat and mouse game between those two. Next. Then there was Don Lincoln, the retired DEA agent who, one of the most incredible undercover operations that I could ever imagine. That in itself would be, just an incredible book. Next. And then Wayne Pike, who had two roles in the story. First he was sheriff of Wythe County in Wytheville, and had the big break of the case came when when Freddie Gilbert, became an informant. That was kind of what cracked the case. That was through Wayne Pike's work. And then later on, he became a U.S. Marshal. And although he, the oath you take as a U.S. Marshal, even though he's retired, there's a lot of that he can't talk about. But told us he spent a great deal of time pursuing and trying to find Wally Thrasher in international countries, using the resources of the U.S. Marshals, and certainly tells you that he had reason to believe that, that Wallace Thrasher was still alive. Next. And Keith Neely, another attorney that represented Olga Thrasher. He was someone, I've talked with Keith a lot, but he interviewed him. He's now in North Carolina in commercial real estate, doing very, very well. he was someone who did time in federal prison himself on drug charges. A lot of people feel he was, unfairly set up in what happened, but nonetheless did time in prison, not practicing law anymore. And he was another one. There's a link with him. He was from Christiansburg. Most of the work he did, I think, was more in Roanoke, as an attorney. But along with Max Jenkins, the attorney you saw earlier, represented, this is going back to my first book again, Steve Epperly on the appeal and Under the Trestle. But back in the day, just a tremendous courtroom attorney, really dynamic, flashy guy. Next. Dickie Sinnott, an interesting part of it to me, he was the associate of Wally's who originally had the connection with John Angel Zabanet, the supplier in Belize. Dickie Sinnott was convicted in 1989 of drug trafficking. Like so many people in the story, did time in federal prison. He's out now, still lives in Fort Pierce, still flies, and has a lot of stories to tell about those days. And he was one thing I didn't mention about Wally. What struck me about him is he was such an adrenaline junkie, Wally Thrasher, that the things he would do for excitement. Probably one of the reasons he became a pilot, but also I think he maybe even more so than the money, what attracted him into smuggling drugs. Dickie Sinnott was the same way. He was a pilot in Vietnam. And there were a lot of those guys down in Florida that when the Vietnam War ended, they were looking for the next thrill, as a pilot. For them, that was smuggling drugs. And I think, and they've said that's why a lot of them, got into that activity. Next. So that's about it. And then can we see if I have another slide, Duncan? I mentioned Doug Tower in our film project, but that is Doug Tower. Interesting background. He's originally from Virginia, grew up in Colonial Heights, went to University of Tampa Film School, which has a really good film school there, and then has spent his whole career in Los Angeles, worked in production for Fox Networks and Fox Sports before starting his own company that, like I said, produces content for a lot of television networks. And he and I are in close contact, trying to move our project forward. Has had some really good meetings with one television network in particular, and we're looking more at one of the streaming services. As streaming services have gotten so popular, that's where we're targeting this. Next, and then next. So these are some more shots from the work that we've done. This is the airport in Dublin that Wally did a lot of work at, interviewing one of his old, just a person that he knew. Next. I think at this point, if it's right, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Montana. And Montana, you talk for as long as you want and say whatever you want. But anyway, so folks, this will be Montana Thrasher. We can give him the screen.
My own? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Ron. That's done a fantastic job with the book and everything. That's you've taken the time and gone and interviewed people and sought out information that was not available. As for me, as Ron said, I'm a police officer with the city of Gainesville in Gainesville, Georgia. Have been there for approximately 17 years. Basically, that's not a very popular job right now, but I am going to try to complete my approximately 2 years and 11 months in order to get the retirement. That what kind of drew me to the profession, early on was I spent a lot of time with Joe Massey while my mom was, attending court and all the trials and everything going on with with my dad's case and her case. And so I spent a lot of time with Joe, and I would run around with his Virginia State Police badge. And so he was kind of like a role model, a father figure, at that time. In fact, I hated to, whenever, him and my mother quit speaking, that, had an effect on me as well, because I felt like that was kind of a stabilizing force, having everything that had happened, with everything that had happened with my father. But yeah, so that's kind of the main draw there. I was also very much interested in the military and firefighter, typical stuff that, most kids want to do or are interested in. And, but all that being said, it's a trying time, obviously, for people in law enforcement. You know, so I've always been very fair and pragmatic, but I see what the problems are. Hopefully, things can stabilize. But I'm looking forward to getting out of the profession. I no longer maintain what I would consider to be a superior interest in the profession, and so I'm looking forward to doing something else, non-law enforcement altogether. And obviously, too, I would say another attraction I can add to that, another attraction to the profession, obviously, is there's a lot of intrigue. If you're interested in true crime, or it's kind of like, you're getting a behind the scenes view when you're involved in law enforcement. When you're an officer, you can look through case files and you can investigate and you can do things that, basically the average person, can't or doesn't have access to. So it's kind of like, getting to see behind the curtain, so to speak. So, but as for my father, I had believed firmly for years, and as a child, I was told over and over that he was deceased and was killed in the plane crash, and I believed that, and I felt that he had passed away. And then even I even placed a VA marker after petitioning for one from the VA, which I received pretty quickly, surprisingly. And I placed it in New Bern, Virginia, at New Bern Cemetery back in August of 2011. And even up to that point, I had still kind of felt that something had gone wrong. He had not contacted anybody. There was no new evidence per se. After Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, all these things had received a maximum amount of attention, to the point where I was convinced that he probably wasn't alive. But over the years, after thinking it and rethinking it, I'm of the opinion that there was some type of mishap that occurred in Belize that day. The plane could have crashed. There could have been a partial takeoff, then a crash, or could have been any number of things. It could have been completely staged. But I'm of the opinion that he most likely survived past that day. As Ron had mentioned, Nelson King, I believe, probably holds 100% of the truth as far as what happened. And there was money obviously missing from his previous flight down to Belize. He had advised John Zabinet's contacts, Mike and Rosanna. He advised them that, hey, Wally's going to bring the money. So you already have money missing. And how well do you know these people? This was a new operation, so I don't know if, and I'm not sure how aware they were of everything going on in Virginia with the plane crash, Fancy Gap. Could he have been a liability? Did they possibly view him through the light of, or did they even view him through the light of having sympathy for him for the things that occurred, and in turn say, hey, well, we'll help you out, if you're looking to disappear. Well, so I mean, you can go both ways with it. And I've even here lately had the thought of, was it improperly investigated on purpose? That's another theory that you could throw out there. But there are several people, Nelson King, I believe, Dickie Sennett's always been straight up and more than willing to talk to and provide information or give me his thoughts on it. I mean, he could also, still be holding back a little bit and for whatever reason. And then, there's, Ben Bradley, and there's some other people who, maybe at some point in time could share a little more and could shed a little light on it. We could, maybe find out, and maybe not, okay, maybe we find out, okay, he lived another 10 years, or he went here, he went there, and did not die that day. Maybe, and at this point I'll settle for whatever I can, whatever I can get in that respect. But yeah, and another thing I'd like to point out is, just remembering from when I was a child that, he was a local hero. He was people treated him like a celebrity. No matter where he went, people would recognize him. And I'll never forget that, to the point where I would, I'd walk up to people and I would say, I would kind of tug on their sleeve or what have you. And I would say, look, that's, who that is, right? Because I just automatically assumed that everybody knew who he was just because he had that charisma and he had the, that ability, to just to light up the room. And so, that stands out in my mind. But and like Ron said, I still wear the ring that was returned to my mother by Dickie Sennett. And also, this is a ring that you may have seen in an earlier photo that Ron showed, where my dad was at him and my mother's wedding. And so, and then also I have, if you do happen to read the book, you'll read an excerpt there where my dad had a rough time taking off and hit some rocks. He was flying out of Columbia and actually tore a hole in the plane, and so some rocks ended up in the cockpit, and so here's a very nondescript, type of rock, but a rock from Columbia nonetheless. So you can imagine, tearing a hole in the cockpit and, ending up with I'd say a pretty large rock up in the cockpit. So, and then after that, flying 14 hours, with a hole in the plane and rocks in the plane. So that he just, he had the complete ability to be unnerved, and most of us have a point by which we, we'll panic, or is a normal human thing. But he just, steely-eyed, and he could, it was nothing he was afraid of. So he, he was, kind of a remarkable guy. And like Ron said, if he could have done anything he put his mind to, but he, he wanted to enjoy life and go for the thrills, and he understood who he was. He was one of those people who was fully aware that he had the charisma and the looks and the ability to draw people, and he so he had that ability to to charm anybody. But and then also I will touch on, my mother. She is been having some health problems, but she's doing better now, and she's now 64 years old and lives in Gainesville, Georgia. And also, she this has brought up a lot of bad memories for her, but I feel like it's been kind of a healing process as well. And so she's looking forward to I think even more finding out finding out more information, to maybe to get some more closure. But yes, and this may be something we never figure out, or there may never be anything that comes out of it, and Nelson King may die with his secrets and everybody else. But while we're here and while we're telling this story and people are reading this book and they're asking more questions, I feel confident that something could come out of it to help shed more light on. I would be more than happy with a revised edition of Chasing the Squirrel. But yeah, I just want to thank Ron again. He's done a fantastic job. He's still researching, obviously promoting Under the Trestle, which is a fantastic book. If anybody hasn't read that, every bit as good as Chasing the Squirrel. So, but anyway, Ron, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Montana. We mentioned Olga, and I was what I said about that, but in her, as I understand, after the whole federal trial ended, she went back, basically had to live with relatives, with the kids, and was driving like an old beat up Honda Civic. So you imagine that she goes from a Jaguar to an old Honda Civic, and worked her way back up. And as I understand, from what I've gathered from her and other people, eventually made a six-figure salary as a career woman, as an interior decorator or interior designer, and that kind of work. So that's just amazing to me, and again, that's an amazing part of the story as well. So certainly, wish her well, and thoughts and prayers with any health challenges she's having.
I'll say too, I do recall the night that the crash on Fancy Gap occurred, because it was roughly 9:30ish at night, getting late for a 6-year-old. So I remember, the phone ringing and my mom running around the house, and then all of a sudden we were told that we were going to be spending the night at Martin Lucas's house, which was a friend of Pam and Jim Lucas, their house. They lived right down the road from us. So I do have a very vivid memory of that night. Kind of the unfamiliar commotion that was occurring. And the immediate uneasiness. I didn't think that was a normal situation. Even at that young age, I knew something wasn't right. So, and then shortly after, several weeks passed, and me and my sister were outside playing. Late fall, rainy fall day. My mother called us in to the cabin, and she told us what had happened. So that's something I remember pretty well.
Wow.
So anytime, it brings back memories. Any type of late fall day, leaves on the ground, rainy, kind of cold, it definitely brings it back to that early November 1984. Kind of that feeling comes back. But yeah, very vivid. And I don't believe that I would have been able to as much as I do had that not. It's just been a normal childhood, right? So, at any rate, people ask me sometimes why I remember as much as I do.
There you go. Okay.
But it's most likely just because that all that occurred so quickly, drastically, and so many moving parts, So.
Montana,
Well,
thank you. We're having a little bit of difficulty with your audio for some reason. It was fine, but
Yeah.
it's there's a lot of reverb, so it's kind of hard to make out.
Let me see if I can adjust the.
It's really not a program unless we have some kind of audio issue.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Any better?
I don't think so. It's just a lot of reverb, a lot of echo.
Yeah, I hear that.
You hear it now?
Great. And Montana, we got a question from Calvin, and I'll share it with you. He says to ask you, how much has the house on Little Creek changed?
Am I audible? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. There's just a little bit of echo, but if you talk a little slowly, I think we can make it out.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the landscaping is much more refined. There's a stone wall down by the creek, whereas there was like a drawbridge. It was very, kind of, you're out in the woods, basically. And then on the side of the house, the owner, the first owner, after we moved out, added a playroom with kind of plexiglass windows. And then beyond, besides that, it's pretty much the same. Just much more refined landscaping and which I've done on 3 occasions since I left. It still feels the same. Kitchen's been updated. Yeah, other than that, it still feels like a cabin that I lived in. So.
Awesome. And Elizabeth, do you want to open it up for questions?
Sure. We had that question come in from Calvin. I don't have any others that have come in yet. So folks, do feel free to put a question in chat or in the Q&A box, either place, wherever you want to type it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Montana, you and I have both mentioned John Zabanet, or John Angel Zabanet, or sometimes you hear him referred to as Angel John Zabanet. But anyway, from the Belize native there who, had the marijuana operation that supplied Wally there at the very end, and a very interesting figure. He did time later on in prison in the U.S. He was kind of snatched out of Panama and brought to the U.S. to stand trial and serve time in a federal prison. And then he was also an informant in the case against Dickie Sennett, who we saw earlier, who was one of Wally's associates. Then he's been back, and then depending on what story you believe, the United States Treasury said he was an associate in the Mexican cartel just in recent years. He's maintained that he's not. He's just in the produce business. His company, Maya King. In fact, I'm told, if you eat bananas from the supermarket, you've probably eaten his bananas that are imported from, it's Belize's #1 export, I'm sorry. So that's pretty interesting. But, he'd certainly be another one who would have information. And, you don't know if he's just this warm and fuzzy international businessman, or if he's this ruthless drug trafficker, or maybe more than likely somewhere in between, but he's also getting on in years. He'd have no reason to talk about this, but would be interesting for someone other than me to go down there and interview him. But,
I would be more than happy to do that.
Would you? Okay, great. No, I joke. I'd be a little.
You never know. In the end, it's the person that ends up talking is the one you least likely expected. Sometimes you never know.
Yeah.
So how these things work out. The one you think that'll say something won't, or take it to the grave. Well, you just never know, and it's an inquiry can be made. I've never thought to even contact him, but. And then there was pretty sketchy information about who Mike and Rosanna really were. I mean, we didn't even know if those were their real names, as I recall. Who were the contacts in Belize? Who were the main people who would communicate with Dickie, and as far as setting up the drug deal.
Interesting.
But it was a totally, obviously we've talked about this before. It was a new operation. It was a new thing. It wasn't like my dad had, formed, solid relationships with Mike and Rosanna or John Zabanet. It was kind of a very new thing, and I'm not sure, how much he trusted them. I don't, and then I always go back to the money, the money aspect, as far as Nelson taking the load without providing the cash, basically saying, well, Wally's coming back. So, I'm just going to take the product. He's coming back with the money. And so I always go back to, right away you have missing money, and then you have Nelson flying back and not on the prescribed flight path. And so, him not talking about anything that occurred back then is obviously suspect, and you agree. So, but yeah, I still believe we could find more out. I'm going to hold out hope for that. So,
yeah, me as well. We had a good question that just came in from Barry. He asks, he said, Ron, do you think anyone at NRV Airport had ties with Wally? Or so that's a question. I interpret that to mean, they were complicit in his activities. And I'll say on the record, I don't think so. We went with the documentary crew and actually interviewed a few people that work there. And the director, and I'm sorry his name slips my mind, but who goes back to that time, who remembered Wally, who's a upstanding citizen for many years. So I would say that no, but I think there were an awful lot of people who looked the other way. That that Wally Thrasher was just such a likable person. So many people did not want to see him go down. They knew he was into something shady, didn't know quite what it was, but or they knew exactly what it was. But I think especially around the airports, he was so charismatic, so well liked, and I've even heard folks say even generous with his money and the things that he'd do. Gifts for people, spending money at the church bake sales, $500 for a pie or whatnot. And I think there are an awful lot of people who look the other way.
Yeah, and you make a great point there, and I was even around on a couple of occasions where somebody would say, to him, you really shouldn't be doing that, but then wanted $10,000 for a down payment on their new home. So you get a lot of that. But yeah, like you said, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, we just couldn't catch him in the act, this and that. I mean, just tell me the truth. Just say you really like the guy, and unless he, made you look bad, you were going to look the other way, because I mean, this was a very small town, a small, a rural area. A lot of people know what you're doing. I mean, it's very hard to, if you're a well-populated area, it's much easier, I would think, to get away with it. But that's kind of where I come from. I get it now. You have to say that you couldn't catch him in the act and this and that. But I'm of the opinion that he did his thing, and local folk hero. I mean, that's he that was what he was, and he. And we talked about him trying out for Indiana Jones. I was with him when he auditioned, I believe, for the second film, right before he went missing. But I remember that very well. But yeah, so he just obviously he probably got tired of people telling him, hey, you look like a movie star, you've got this charisma, you got the looks, go try to be an actor. And then obviously in the book, you do mention that he had landed a role, I believe a small television role, but unfortunately the production was, not properly funded or canceled prior to them beginning filming. So, but yeah, so I agree with you on that totally, wholeheartedly. But that's not to say he wasn't careful about what he did, at the airport. And a lot of things that he coordinated, they were done, obviously not to make people look bad per se. So, he would land and they would unload the plane and the product would be gone. I mean, it wasn't, they didn't stand around for hours, so joking and telling stories. It was very, you had the walkie-talkies, everything was coordinated. And so, unfortunately, like you mentioned, he had to go be a pallbearer at that funeral, and the kind of the dominoes fell after that. So Nelson King was, basically a competent pilot in good weather, could, follow, simple flight paths, but everything the dominoes really fell there. It was, my dad's not flying the plane. Here comes Nelson flying in bad weather. loaded down with dope. And then he, not to mention, unfortunately, the co-pilot, Mark Moreland Bailey, who passed away in the crash. He was obviously not a skilled pilot. So, but yeah, so that's kind of, it's unfortunate because I do wonder, I do know that at the time that that crash occurred, he was really wanting to, I think, finally wanting to get out of the business. My mom was putting a lot of pressure on him to, okay, if you're going to go for the big score, you're going to go for the, if you're going to make $1 million, $2 million off of this big cocaine deal, then get out of it, because I think I really do believe that right before, the crash on Fancy Gap, I really do believe he was starting to feel the heat a little bit, like he felt like he was being watched, or he wasn't maybe as carefree, especially when it came down to doing the drug business. I think I could, you could sense it. I really do believe. And that combined with the pressure from my mother to get out of it, she wanted him out of it, but she didn't mind spending the money though. So.
You do have another question about whether or not Wally ever flew out of Mercer, West Virginia Airport, the airport close to the house on Little Creek in Bland.
I'd have to get back to them on that. I do have my dad's flight, records, every time he landed and took off from wherever. He actually landed in Gainesville, Georgia a few times, which is pretty interesting since I worked for the city of Gainesville. But yeah, I could check on that and get back to them.
Cool. So Montana, you actually have his flight records?
Yeah, I've got, like I said, probably from 77 up through 82, 83, the city, the date, the time, the airport. And then I also have his flight bag that was carried out actually by another pilot after he went missing, and who actually returned it to me a few years later, or a few years ago. But it was his flight bag that he would carry all his maps and everything in. So,
wow.
But yeah, so that's, it's pretty, I've actually got a lot of stuff upstairs I'm still going through, and, hundreds of newspapers and more transcripts and more, his flight records. I've got all his maps, nautical maps. And so, but yeah.
Wow. In the book, I'm not sure I ever talked to you directly about it, but the boat that ran aground in South Carolina that he was questioned about, did you have any additional insight?
Yeah.
Did you have any additional insight on that? I don't think I ever asked you directly about that.
Not, I would have to speak to my mother about that, because I, like I remember you asking me about it previously. But the only thing I know, kind of off the cuff, I guess, is obviously as much as is that he, had brokered a deal, to deliver that, I believe it was marijuana, and that he was with two individuals who were considered to be, savvy with the boat, per se, boat, real boat guys who seemingly ran aground there in Charleston, and obviously they had to make their escape shortly thereafter. But yeah, I will. I'll talk to my mother about that again, because she's always obviously has little bits of nuggets of information and insight that sometimes it's hard to retain every little bit of information. But she, I think she could have more to offer on that as far as information.
Great. And anybody have any other questions? If you want to post them in Q&A.
Ron, I'd just like to ask you what when you were writing this book, what surprising thing did you uncover? What were you most surprised by in this process? And reading it, I was surprised how much I love learning about the flying elements, right? So I'm wondering, what did you learn?
Yeah, that was eye-opening to me. I guess more than anything, and this is probably more in that era, but how often that law enforcement would know someone was trafficking drugs, but they could never catch them with the drugs and, and with the money. And I think it says in the book, I believe it was a file was, the Virginia State Police first opened a file on Wally Thrasher in either 81 or 82. So they were on to him 2 or 3 years before that Fancy Gap plane crash. They were doing surveillance at airports they thought he was flying in and out of. There's the one on down toward Withville that parallels 81. I know they had that airport staked out, hoping to catch him there with either the drugs or the money. But he was an example of how difficult it was to catch these guys that were that savvy, but that was, I thought they could just, well, I know that guy's trafficking drugs, we'll just arrest him, It wasn't until I actually talked to both sides that I realized just exactly how difficult it is to make the case, because when they arrest somebody, they want to make sure they can convict them. So that was very interesting to me. And, then also I mentioned this, but just what I'm not glorifying it by any means, but what a kind of gentlemanly business the whole marijuana pilot thing was. All of these guys, a lot of them had the same attitude of Wally, happy-go-lucky. If somebody did them wrong in a deal or shorted them, they weren't going to have a shootout with them. They were just going to, give them the middle finger and never do business with them again and forget it, So that was that was interesting to me, just kind of understanding a little bit of the mindset of the way those guys did business, I guess.
Thank you. You do have a couple more questions. One from Carly is, are you working on any other books?
Well, thank you. Thanks for asking. I'm about now 95% done with another true crime book. True crime now is kind of my genre, kind of my thing. And it's another book about a murder case, a cold case murder that happened in my hometown where I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. It was a 1981 murder of a school teacher by the name of Olivia Christian. She was 32 years old, lived by herself in an apartment in Hampton. Just an outstanding person. Could probably, make parallels between her and Gina Hall. Just just an outstanding person. Good Christian young lady. And the murder was never solved. I interviewed some of the detectives that worked the case initially. They had many suspects. None of the suspects panned out. The years go by. Again, that was 1982. And in Hampton police, it was always the cold case. They don't have an active cold case squad the way it would work. If a detective was caught up on their other cases, they could go back and work a cold case. All the detectives over the course of 3 decades had worked that case at one time or another, could never solve it, never find a suspect. Then in 2011, a detective by the name of Randy Mayer happened to bring home the case file one weekend, read through it, came in on a Monday morning in 2011 and said, hey, boss, I think I can solve this, and asked permission to work it. And over the course of a 7-year investigation up through 2018, managed to identify a prime suspect, also linked that suspect to 2 other murders, which meant he was a serial killer, as well as just, many sexual assaults as well. The person was in his 60s and still living in Hampton. He was charged with murder and went on trial for murder in 2018. I won't tell you how the book ends, but was, if not the oldest, one of the oldest cold cases solved in Virginia history. And it was solved without DNA, just good old-fashioned detective work and shoe leather, which is interesting. You hear a lot about old murder cases being solved by DNA. This was just an incredible job of investigating and working it. But working title of the book is Eyes of a Monster, and hoping to have it out by late June or July. Another really interesting part of the case is the key witness in the murder trial in 2018 was a witness who back in 81, she was only 16 years old, and told police at the time that she saw a man lurking outside the victim's apartment, looking in the window, leaning in, listening to her apartment door, acting suspicious. She saw him leave, provided a description to a sketch artist who made a sketch. And apparently the police in 81 did not find her account credible. But then when the case was reopened in 2011, she was located. She was now in her 50s, and she testified in the murder trial about what she saw 34 years earlier. So just an interesting book with a lot of really neat twists and turns, and just a really, really good murder mystery. So thanks for asking. And again, I hope to have that out by June or July.
We're going to be looking for that one.
Awesome.
We have a question from Barry. Did Olga ever have any death threats to her life?
Montana?
I don't believe so. She's never mentioned that. She's never confided in me anything like that. So, obviously she was offered witness protection when all this got started, but she was so focused on me and my sister and everything that had already occurred. She said, well, no, I'm not going to hide. And, if they moved us off, they were going to move us to Tacoma, Washington, something. I guess that's where everybody goes. But she didn't want them to change our names. And she felt like we were already traumatized enough. And my mom is just, she's tough. She's a fighter. And she just, she said, no, I will not hide. So, and we've obviously been fortunate. Here we are, 30 plus years later. So, no, I don't believe she ever did.
Very interesting. I saw Tracy asked a question about other books in the works. I think we answered that. And it really neat thing is I'm approached a lot by mostly people that were in law enforcement about hey, you got to write about this. It's interesting. My experience is a lot of law enforcement officers, whether it's local jurisdictions or state police or even federal, when they're active duty, they won't talk about current cases. They won't share a lot of information. But when they retire, then they're willing to share information. They don't want things to be forgotten. So I'm approached by a lot of former law enforcement people, who will contact me either on social media or phone or email about, hey, you ought to write about this case. In fact, Ron Shelburne, who lives in Pulaski County, he was a basketball player at Radford's in Radford's Hall of Fame. Yesterday, he emailed me an article about a Christiansburg murder of a dentist. That was just, the more I read into it, just a fascinating case. He said, hey, this is something that's pretty interesting. But then looking, 2 books in the pipeline, what I think is going to be my next book project after I get the one about this Hampton, Virginia murder out. There was a murder in the mid 80s, gosh, it was either 84, 86. And Tracy, I'm thinking of this because I know in Northern Virginia there was in Manassas. It was a Virginia state trooper by the name of Johnny Rush Bowman, he was killed at his townhouse in Manassas, and the murder was never solved. He answered the door at 3 o'clock in the morning when the doorbell rang, and someone stabbed him multiple times right in the foyer of his house with his wife and daughter home. One of the biggest investigations ever in the history of the state police. Hundreds of state police officers worked the case for months, and the murder was never solved. Like I said, it was 84, 86. His name was Johnny Rush Bowman. His daughter, as I understand, he was or still is a police officer in Manassas or Prince William County. And book also has connections to Southwest Virginia, in that Johnny Rush Bowman was originally from Pulaski County, and there was a prime suspect in the case who for years they thought actually did it, and apparently he was cleared, who was also from Southwest Virginia. So it's a murder case set in Northern Virginia, Manassas, but also has some pretty cool ties to Southwest Virginia. So I'm kind of exploring that now, and if there's some good sources I can talk to about it and kind of get information, I think I'm going to write about that one next in the pipeline.
I have a question for you, Montana. Calvin's asking if you have your pilot's license.
Actually, no, I do not. I'm actually not real fond of flying, but
Come
commercial
on.
is fine, but short of me getting in a plane, a small plane without my dad, it's not something I'm real, fond of. I'm too much, I guess if I could control, if I felt like I had a little bit more control, but yeah, I'm going to stick to commercial unless it's my dad flying the plane. So I flew with him several times, and so and I do remember being really scared. He wanted me to close the door. I felt like I was going to fall out. I do remember that. And then he would let me pretend like I was flying. I don't think I was flying the plane. Um, but yeah, that's not something I ever really wanted to get into. Plus, and another part of it, looking back and putting more thought into it, when you're 6 years old and you're told your father's been killed in a plane crash, that's so I'm thinking plane, that's all I'm thinking about. So
Gosh.
that could have been a deterrent for me to kind of be ever gain any real interest in that, to be honest with you. Stick to
Interesting.
Delta.
And it's been interesting, Montana, the things you've shared. That's always, I always enjoy doing these. And even someone I've spent a lot of time talking with like you, I always manage to learn something new. So that's, thanks for sharing what you did. That's very interesting.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
Good.
My least favorite part of a program is always wrapping it up because it's always so much fun. Thank you both for being here, for offering this program. It looks like we don't have any open questions at the moment. Is there anything else either of you wants to add? I want to be mindful of your time because I know we've kept you. No complaints though.
Yeah. I appreciate it. And, Montana, something you said earlier, like a lot of people, I find it disturbing, there's the state of public opinion toward law enforcement nowadays. And I don't want to go on a soapbox except to say, I'm having gotten to know so many people that work in law enforcement, like yourself, the folks in Radford there, so many of you guys know, former Radford police officers like Johnny Butler, Gary Harmon, Andy Wilburn, Austin Hall. I've talked about a lot of the state police folks. Just the job you guys do and the dedication and the service and the commitment and your lives on the line. Understand, there are some problems that small little tiny percentage of police officers, some problems with the overall system, but
Mm-hmm.
It bothers you, that someone, like yourself who, seems like they've done such a great service that, because of the current state of things. I mean, I get it. I understand that part. If I were in your shoes, I would feel the same way. But when I say it's a shame, I just mean the state of things now. And, I think there's so many of us that are not as vocal who are just pro law enforcement, just really appreciate the job that everyone does. And great thing about writing true crime books, I've got to know so many people, in law enforcement that just tremendous respect. And, my heroes used to be athletes, and now I swear they're, people that work in law enforcement. So that was just one thing that came to my mind about what you shared earlier. So, understand we all appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you, Ron, and it's much appreciated.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, the climate is what it is right now, and obviously you're always going to have you're going to attract bad apples in every profession. But hopefully something good will come out of all this, and you know, but if anything, people come up to me every day, thank you for what you do. And that's all fine and dandy, but and it's appreciated. But like I said, it all goes back to Joe Massey. I don't think I would have, gotten into this profession without his, him being around. And I would like to reach out to him again because it's been a long time since I talked to him. I guess, thank you very much for everything you've done. If you haven't picked up Chasing the Squirrel, go get it. And it's fantastic. And all your books are fantastic. So.
Well, thank you, you guys. I really appreciate that. Thanks. Like your English teacher said, just pick a good subject to write about.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks.
And I look forward to doing this again whenever the next one is. Well, let's do it again. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Hey, it's getting better every time. You're better than last time we did it. So that's good.
Yeah, I'm starting to get it. This is all new for me. I think this is my third Zoom ever. So
that's great.
I'd like to thank the attendees for being with us tonight and for your great questions. Thank you, Montana, so much for being here. Thank you, Ron. We're really looking forward to your next book. Remind us again of the title and the release date, we think.
Yeah, so June or July of this year.
Okay.
Working title is Eyes of a Monster, and then the subtitle, A Detective's Relentless Cold Case Pursuit of a Serial Killer.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks for asking. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
You'll be the first to know, Elizabeth.
All right, I'm gonna be waiting. We're gonna be, I'll ask you to come do another program with this.
Cool.
Yeah.
You bet. Well, great. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for attending. I appreciate it. And thanks again, Montana, Elizabeth, for helping make this happen.
My pleasure.
Have a good night. Yep.
Too. Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks. Okay.